Hello, and welcome to this second day of what let's call the Yale via Zoom conference on judgment and value in the humanities. I have the honor of introducing this morning's lecturer, Helen Small, who is Merton Professor of English Language and Literature at the University of Oxford. Professor Small's books include Love's Madness, Medicine, the Novel, and Female Insanity. The Long Life, a study of old age in literature from Shakespeare to Saul Bellow and J.M. Coetzee. The Value of the Humanities, and most recently, just last year, The Function of Cynicism at the Present Time. I think of Helen Small as a defender, unusual in our time, of the value of public discussion and controversial argument about ideas and their practical consequences. She recounts and interprets the debates of the great Victorians, Arnold and Huxley on the definition of culture, Mill and Carlyle on inequality, and connects them with the by no means entirely distinct arguments that have arisen in our time concerning the value of judgment and the meaning of value itself. Her lucidity is constant, and she is willing to be surprised. I should say, unfortunately, Martin Hagland, who was scheduled to be the respondent to Helen Small's talk today, has had a family emergency and is unable to respond. So taking his place will be myself, and Ben Barash will just ask a brief question after perhaps a brief comment and then go to a discussion with the audience. Helen Small will be speaking to us this morning on judgment across a lifetime.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? All good? Great, thank you. Thank you very warmly to Ben and to David for the invitation to speak today. And let me echo the thanks that you gave yesterday to the Yale Humanities program and the Carnegie Foundation for sponsoring this conference. I'm really sorry that it's not in person. It would be lovely to be in Connecticut. I'd like to say a few framing things about this paper that you're about to hear, which may help to ease what I suspect is going to be its rather English or English New Zealand eccentricity. If the paper were to have an epigraph, it would be Stuart Hall remarking in, if I remember rightly, a late interview, or it may have been a conversation after a conference, that one of the problems created by humanities funding and student recruitment crises is that they tend to drive us back on the old canon, looking for objects of study that will be robust enough to withstand public skepticism. We go back to Shakespeare, Burke, Keats, and since we don't have to be antique here, say Douglas, Du Bois, Morrison, fill in as you wish. We ask the object, the writing, the work of art to do more of the work for us, in short. And if we're not careful, it's as if cultural studies never happened. I'm going to say very little about objects in this paper. The last chapter of The Value of the Humanities sets out what I felt I had to say in 2013 about the value of aesthetic objects and scholarly study of them for its own sake. Instead, I want to take advantage of the opportunity that conferences offer. I take it to be a bit more provocative. And since this is a conversation, I'm assuming primarily within the profession, not between our profession and those outside it, I'm going to cause a bit more trouble for the efforts that we're making collectively to speak without apology about the things that matter. A simple summary of the structure of what follows is that it falls into two halves. The first is trying to define, with not enough help from philosophy, something I want to be able to talk about and that I think matters greatly to our aesthetic experience, but that seems to fall between two disciplinary stools, or more than two. The shorter second section is trying to work out some more specific areas in which conversation might be happening, and I think largely isn't. The risk is that there may not be a subject here, but I'm happy to try to fight my ground. I will have one potentially outrageous thing to say at the very end, which you may treat as an enticement. One last bit of throat clearing. I'm conscious for reasons of exceptional personal circumstances over the past several weeks that my respondent Martin was in a really difficult position, having received paper very late or email copy very late. So it's now David and Ben, and I'm very grateful to them stepping into the position of having very little notice to respond. Okay, we start. In a brief but characteristically thought-provoking essay entitled Futures, Adam Phillips poses a question about truth that I want to recast here as a question about judgment. How long is something true for, he asks, and why should duration over time be any kind of criterion for the validity of a so-called insight? He has in view taxingly both individual insights and the insights we possess as a culture. The paradox, as he puts it, of living in passing time and craving durable truths. Posed as a question about truth, this points us in the direction of, but also beyond, the standard terrain of epistemological skepticism. Rearticulated as a question about judgments of taste, its implications might be equally interesting to an aesthetician, an epistemologist, or a metaphysician, who might of course be the same person. How long is a judgment of taste valid for? Why should duration over time be any kind of criterion for the validity of its so-called insight? And what are the implications of either relinquishing certain judgments of taste or allowing them to hold less importance for us than we once did? There's a version of this paper that would be much more political. It would start perhaps with an example of a taste let go or substantially recalibrated in the light of new political insights. For this first attempt at my subject, however, I'm going to remain more focused on questions of temporality and what it does, the rub of time on judgment, if you will. What I have to say will make some use of some good thinking in recent moral philosophy, but I'm not aiming at the analytic precision that most philosophers of aesthetics would want to bring to the subject. Indeed, I rather suspect that most analytic philosophers would have a hard time permitting the personal and cultural longue durée aspects of the question to occupy the same space. Let me start by going back to an area of discussion that first interested me in the course of writing the Long Life's chapter on the pressures on personal identity across a lifetime, and that has recently started to strike me somewhat differently. The fact that it's striking me differently is, you would intuit, part of the reason for putting you through what may for some of you be some preliminary repetition. So consider once again the 19th century Russian noblewoman scenario, next slide, as described in Derek Parfit's Reasons and Persons. Sorry, that was the Adam Phillips, here you go. In several years, a young Russian will inherit vast estates. Because he has socialist ideals, he intends now to give the land to the peasants, but he knows that in time his ideals may fade. To guard against this possibility, he does two things. He first signs a legal document, which will automatically give away the land and which can be revoked only with his wife's consent. He then says to his wife, "Promise me that if I ever change my mind and ask you to revoke this document, you will not consent." He adds, "I regard my ideals as essential to me. If I lose these ideals, I want you to think that I cease to exist. I want you to regard your husband then, not as me, the man who asks you for this promise, but only as his corrupted later self. Promise me that you would not do what he asks." Bernard Williams's objection to the Russian nobleman scenario when it first appeared in essay form in 1973 was that it's, as Parfit calls it, it's critical presentaimism, whose comedy strikes me more forcibly than I recall it doing in about 2003, that it creates a nonetheless serious problem with respect to the exercise of authority over our future selves. It's far from clear, he replied, why a person should regard their present aims and values as having higher authority than their future ones. Why should I hinder my future projects, he asked. I think this is, yeah. Why should I hinder my future projects from the perspective of my present values rather than inhibit my present projects from the perspective of my future values? It's not enough to say that evidently present action must flow from present values. If one believes that the future will bring greater enlightenment, one's present actions are likely to be shaped in order to assist that outcome. One is to that extent already dissatisfied with one's present values. For Williams, more needed to be said about why the Russian nobleman should therefore be so committed to his present aims. He may, for instance, have a theory of degeneration of the middle-aged, but then he should no doubt reflect that when middle-aged, he will have a theory of the naivete of the young. Parfit's answer is incorporated into the book version of the argument in a separate section entitled Different Attitudes to Time. Next slide. Suppose I believe, oh, I didn't do it, I'm really sorry, stay where you were. Suppose I believe that with increasing knowledge and experience, I shall grow wiser. On this assumption, I should give to my future evaluative desires more weight than I give to my present evaluative desires, since my future desires will be better justified. But if I both assume that I'm always growing wiser and can now predict some future change of mind, I have in effect already changed my mind. If now I believe that some later belief will be better justified, I should have this belief now. The contrary assumption is that as time passes, I shall become less wise, and that the change in my ideals will be a corruption. The loss of ideals is commonplace, and judgment often goes. In successive editions of their selected poems, many poets make worse and worse selections. On this assumption, I should give greater weight to what I used to value or believe. But in the same way, if I accept this assumption, I would still believe what I used to believe, even if I care less. For Parfit, to have a theory of what will happen to oneself with the passage of time is to have always a present reason for acting accordingly. My problem with this claim circa 2003 was that belief and desire appear to have collapsed into one another. It's surely possible to believe, I cogitated, or for that matter, less strongly to be able to predict that one may come to change one's mind without having in effect already done so. The possibility of a change in one's values for better or for worse is common knowledge and something we each of us learn for ourselves from routine observation of other people's lives, including reading about the lives and choices of poets. I won't rehearse here the objections other philosophers made to the hypothesis that all links to the future are made by present desires. It's Thomas Nagel's phrase. What strikes me at this distance more forcibly is that there's something oddly contextless, notwithstanding the imaginative production of a miniature Tolstoy narrative, about arguments that invite us to opt either for a strong version of identity continuity that would sustain the validity of our judgments in literature, as in morals and politics, or for a weaker version of identity that would admit a loosening or even abandonment of our judgments. The weaker version of identity is where I now see more comedy than I formerly did in the choice faced by the nobleman's wife, taking her as a representative actor in a more generally applicable rational drama. The effect of either agreeing or disagreeing with the nobleman's prohibition on change in his own values will be to leave those values relativized, reduced to personal commitments without social parameters. It also leaves them stranded in time, frozen at the point where they were made, like historic exhibits of judgment, not to be meddled with, but set behind imaginary glass and respected. The due consequences, it occurs to me, might amount to the same thing. Imagine that the nobleman is indeed a poet. Imagine that he's Wordsworth. The consequences for literary futurity are what? That we should stick with the two-part prelude of 1799 and count everything thereafter as afflatus or political betrayal and not really Wordsworth at all? I realize that the position is not without adherents. What would be the consequences of adopting a view of literary judgment less tied to reasoning about one's self, more alert to the ways in which individual judgments are reached, and my point here, sustained, modified, or relinquished over the course of a life amid social and cultural conditions for collective judgments? Some aspects of the question seem already well covered by existing criticism and theory, others much less so. I am, for a start, going to exclude that body of writing of which Bloom's Anxiety of Influence is the most famous example, which asks us to think about key areas of literary value and judgment as the effects of a quasi-Oedipal reaction of one generation against the values and judgments of the dominant influence in the generation before, you all know it. Articulated over time as that critical narrative is, it in reality says almost nothing about human temporality. Bloom's strong rewriting of Rilke is to the point here. Art is the index of men born too late. Art is by definition out of time here, not in it, struggling to make itself felt belatedly. And belatedness, Bloom remarks in the preface to his second edition, seems to me not a historical condition at all, nor a biographical one, but one that belongs to the literary situation as such. Writers interested in canon formation as cultural inheritance have sometimes found stronger cause to think about what happens when literary values are passed down through the years as inherited cultural capital. The passing of value from one generation to the next looks like a key conceptual moment at which value is observably subject to cultural challenge, and thus it should surely follow to change over a lifetime, since one full human lifetime encompasses several generations. John Guillory's most suggestive thinking on this score comes when he reflects on the important contribution to formation of an English literary canon in the mid-18th century that came with the realization that progressive political agendas required vernacular linguistic refinement and a departure from the old scholastic canon of the clergy. This is Thomas Sheridan as cited by Guillory. Shall we not endeavour to secure to future generations, entire and unchanged, their birthright in Milton, Addison, and Swift? Or shall we put in the power of one giddy and profuse age to dissipate or render of no value the heaps of treasure now collected in the many excellent books written by English authors? We are as a discipline well practiced at disputing the type of cultural ambition Sheridan voices here, though we might also admire the social inclusiveness of the educational vision. Typically, the grounds of disputation will be the security of aesthetic judgment that takes the form of commanding rather than commending, in Mary Motherstill's nice distinction, the undifferentiated sense of a population to be educated, future generations, irrespective of those varieties in social and cultural experience that should suggest a plurality of valid objects of interest, a variety of routes to valuation, and fundamentally ongoing and ineluctable linguistic change. Rather less is typically said about how dissensus around the pressure towards stabilization of values is being expressed through living in time and identifying in what degree with the generation into which one is born. This seems the more surprising if we reflect that cultural change is the whole reason for investigating educational reform. When the present age is giddy and profuse, at risk of squandering what wiser forebears have accumulated on its behalf, education must come to the rescue of timeless excellence, as Sheridan has it. Guillory comments. Typically, next slide, thank you. Typically, amid complex social conditions of literary production, the literary tradition is generalized as the heritage of a homogeneous literary culture. And again, literary curricula are capable of assimilating the otherwise dangerous heterodoxies expressed in some works by means of homogenizing methods of textual appropriation. The ideological effect rides on the back of the effect of sociolinguistic differentiation, produced by access to the literary language, which is there its vector. Only in this way can one explain the use of the same canonical works to inculcate in different generations of students many different and even incompatible ideologies. Guillory's eye is on something different from what my eye is on. His is on correcting a common mistaken assumption that value, or some major element of value, resides in the literary texts themselves, pointing us instead to the sociolinguistic effects of an education into literary language, which then carries all before it. The close of the paragraph nevertheless sheds some sideways light on what elements of the story are being suppressed or pushed to the side of the explanation in order to tell that general story about how canons take hold. How, Guillory asks, can we explain the demonstrable fact that generation after generation of students have been persuadable of the value of the same texts? It's in the way of cultural political change that the political agendas of persuasion have changed, sometimes radically. The tastes and values of the students, it seems, have not, or rather, since they surely have, not in a way or to a degree that initiates pressure in the model. We're encouraged to think about canon formation as having as one of its effects not quite the erasure, but the political weakening of how people change socially and individually over time. If literary works don't produce for later generations of readers the same effects of persuasion their authors may have intended for readers in their own time, this is not seen to be because the experience, meanings, and thus values of new generations are putting substantial pressure on the system. The system of literary reproduction and its educational apparatus is doing most of the work. My intention is not to critique the argument of cultural capital, rather to use this rightly influential argument as a good example of how difficult it seems to be to talk at a systemic level about two dimensions of judgment that I take to be crucial to debates about canonicity. First, the through-wash of generational change as a contributor to gradual cultural shifts in valuation. Second, personal change amid that wider process of change in what we value over a lifetime. These dimensions of judgment are linked, albeit complicatedly so. Can't even say it complicatedly, because there will be a high degree of contingency in how any one individual relates to their generational cohort. If I have older parents and or older siblings, for example, my generational affiliation is likely to be subtly different to that of someone with younger parents or siblings. If I go to an old-fashioned school rather than a progressive one, similar displacements may be visible. And I will spare this audience any more than the briefest reference to that not quite vanished form of British post-imperial patronage that used to consist in telling a New Zealander that her culture was 50 years behind the UK's. For clarity, I'm not talking here about our capacity to recognize generational subcultures, the Beat generation, Generation X, and so on. We have numerous informative critical accounts of how such particular generational resettings of taste and overturning of established judgments happen. I'm trying to isolate rather something that is continually happening as part of the process of cultural change and readily recognized as a feature of our culture considered as a whole, but not isolated as what it surely is, a major factor in setting judgment up for discussion. Part of the problem here is that change in judgment over time doesn't seem satisfactorily generalizable at the level of generational tastes, even though such tastes have obvious and often marked effects. Taste in music, to take one obvious example, or something I think we should be talking about a lot more in humanities debates, taste in the preferred medium of culture. That is really a very deep threat, I think, to literary studies right now. There have been attempts to do something similar at the level of the period. Michael Baxendale's concept of the period I, for example, where the I stands metonymically for a cognitive competence that changes over time. But they too easily fall prey to the complaint Amélie Rorty directs at age cohort descriptions generally. Some are openly teleological, she says, others are implicitly normative. Others characterize the strengths and weaknesses, the virtues and vulnerabilities of what they project as distinguishable life stages. Yet others profess normative neutrality. Even culturally specific, presumptively non-normative theories remain extremely general, severely limited, that is, in their descriptive, let alone their predictive power. I suspect that the feature of judgment that I'm trying to name falls, as I said, between two theoretical stools, as it were, and that in attempting to talk about it, I'm in danger of taking a rather dense and thorny route towards saying the obvious, that generational through-pull contributes to cultural shifts in taste and judgment, insofar as many of our values are bequeathed to us, but this doesn't make them unchallengeable dicta. The energy and desire for independence that belong to youth will always put pressure on established norms of taste and judgment. The thing is, as my small daughter used to say to me, I'm not trying to explain the social circumstances and arrangements in full that condition aesthetic judgments. I'm trying to explain something that happens at the level of lived temporality, that's apparent in both its personal and indeed its cohort effects, but not at all easy to talk about theoretically. Pierre Bourdieu might be expected to provide a stronger theoretical handle on the issue. In practice, the short section of distinction entitled The Mark of Time is almost entirely focused on differences in ethical disposition between the young and the old, the challengers and the possessors in the workplace. Nevertheless, there is something here to help. Age, he reminds us, is an independent variable, which may tend to mask the complete system of relationships which constitutes the true principle of the specific strength and form of the effects registered in any particular correlation. The most independent of independent variables conceals a whole network of statistical relations which are present implicitly in its relationship with any given opinion or practice, say aesthetic judgment as an opinion, aesthetic valuation as a practice. This seems beyond dispute. It's basic sociology. And yet the same writer, sorry, I don't mean he's basic, that bit of it's basic. And yet the same writer invites us briefly to consider a dialectic which is established throughout a lifetime between dispositions and positions, aspirations and achievements, recognizing temporality as an axis along which certain patterns of change become apparent in that dialectic. Social aging, he writes, is nothing other than the slow renunciation or disinvestment, socially assisted and encouraged, which leads agents to adjust their aspirations to their objective changes, espouse their condition, become what they are, and make do with what they have, even if this entails accepting bereavement of all the lateral possibilities they've abandoned along the way. Once again, human temporality appears at the margins of the account of taste, only in order to be parked as a potential area of deception for the sociologist, one in which the true drivers of taste will be mistaken for false, and in which regrettable social mechanisms will channel individuals towards positions already adjusted to them. The tastes associated with old age are, as it were, waiting to be inhabited by us. One last philosophical voice assists me by offering a stronger grip on what's being lost from the social picture of aesthetic judgment when we displace the human lifetime. Dominic Lopez invites us to consider the social infrastructure of aesthetic agency. Oh my God, I've put Sarah's, I'm really sorry. The conditions of writing this PowerPoint's terrible. Lopez, L-O-P-E-S. Very strange. I'm now mentally trying to merge him with Michael Serres, but let's stop that. Dominic Lopez invites us to consider the social infrastructure of aesthetic agency, and with it the basic conditions for aesthetic judgment, by reworking that old heuristic device, the state of nature story. Some ground rules: no historical reconstructions and no Hobbesian talk of scarcity. Language isn't a scarce resource. Once upon a time out on the Serengeti, our distant ancestors were provisioned with plenty of low-level aesthetic goodness, charming sunsets, pungent flowers, washboard abs. In view of the goodness of these things, they had aesthetic reason to act in ways that turned out to enlarge their aesthetic inventory. To inject a dose of archaeological reality into the scenario, suppose that they had aesthetic reason to make cosmetics and symmetrically proportioned tools. Acting on their aesthetic reasons, they added aesthetic goodness to the world. An important occasion looms, and every member of the group dresses up and paints their body. Each digs pigmented clay, pounds it on a stone into a powder, binds fine reed into a brush, conceptualizes design, applies the pigment, and proudly displays it. Perfecting every element in the skill set demands time and resources, and performance limits are soon reached. Once the limits are reached, the way to get even better makeup is for members of the group to specialize, perfecting their specialized skills with an eye to trading off with other specialists. We're in a classic game theory playoff scenario where the pre or extra historic denizens of the Serengeti have reasons to act, to achieve, to specialize, and to coordinate, improving and elaborating the social scaffolding around their aesthetic activities as they do so. What interests me, and Lopez isn't blind to it, is how easy it is, even as in a scenario designed to express development over time, to remove human temporalities from the scenario. Perfecting the skill set demands time. And it's in part the limit on the time available to any one individual that drives specialization. Narrowly, the important occasion is looming. Okay, there will be other occasions, but as the society progresses, it becomes less and less easy for an individual to master the full range of required skills competitively. Keep carrying that argument forward, and we get to the point where most of us will not in our lifetime master body painting adequately or competitively, let alone later developed arts such as the violin. Rational explanations of scaffolding in the state of aesthetic nature tend to simplify in two ways, Lopez observes. They typically consider interactions of only two aesthetic agents with two choices each. They also abstract away from the temporal dimension. Dropping those simplifications, this is him again, only intensifies the dynamics that give aesthetic agents reason to act in ways that ramp up specialization with cooperation. But when Lopez adds complexity back in, only a very limited sense of temporality reappears. We get a glimpse of what cultural inheritance does to advance specialization, but no sense of how advancement of skills makes a difference generation by generation, and thus within the lifetime of those affiliated with that generation. Quote, descendants of those body painters who have opted for the more successful of the styles developed have stronger aesthetic reason to follow in their ancestors' footsteps. They will be more likely to acquire competence for achievement. In order to achieve further, they will likely have to craft subgenres and so on. It wouldn't in practice be too difficult to elaborate a finer scaffolding whereby generational patterns of specialization and variation in aesthetic practice are added on to the basic social structure. But I suspect we're at this point reaching the level of elaboration where the state of nature story starts to look and feel too much like a state of nature realistic novel, its heuristic value weakening as it does so. Not for the first time, I'm reminded of a comic gambit in Derek Parfit's last work, On What Matters, in which he elaborates a fetchingly detailed maxim for our consideration, Kant with a lot more humanizing detail, as it were, only to retract all the pointless detail a few pages later. Spot readers be warned. A maxim should not include any details whose absence would have made no difference to this person's decision to do whatever he's doing, writes Parfit. A state of nature story can be more expansive than a maxim, but presumably shouldn't become so detailed that our eye is taken off the prize. Here, understanding the social nature of aesthetic agency. On the other hand, what kind of social model of the aesthetic doesn't attend to human temporality? I'm aware of some circularity looming in the argument, which might be reducible to the perennial problem of theory. Good theoretical arguments want a strong social dimension. Well, I want them to have that. But just how much of a social dimension rather depends on the level of explanation. Vertical metaphors quickly come into play. Higher level description tends to have little room for temporalities, more for time. It's a key ambition of age studies and critical age theory to challenge that verticality, so that higher level arguments, which fairly readily open the door to, say, geographic or ethnic cultural variation, start to consider age-related variation as similarly critical to experience. All the more interesting then to consider, as Patrick McKee invites us to do, the one moment in Kant's third critique when the question of old age is admitted to the theoretical picture, signaling a willingness to recognize specific aesthetic interests and abilities related to time of life. Next slide. There is a kind of misanthropy, very improperly so called, the predisposition to which is often found in the mind of many well-thinking people as they get older, which is certainly philanthropic enough as far as their benevolence is concerned, but is, because of long, sad experience, far removed from any pleasure in human beings. Evidence of this is to be found in the tendency to withdraw from society, the fantastic wish for some isolated seat, or even in young people, the dream of happiness in being able to pass their life on an island unknown to the rest of the world, which the novelists or poets know so well how to exploit. McKee comes to this passage with an interest tangential, to put it mildly, to the main philosophical literature on Kant. He proposes that Kant's aesthetic theory might benefit gerontology by offering hypotheses useful in explaining certain kinds of late life withdrawal. Empirical inquiry might even follow. Condensing a technical and already quite condensed argument to its essentials, the significance of the isolated country seat fantasy, as McKee reads it, is that it discloses something crucial about the experience of the sublime that makes it not just, as generations of romanticism classes have observed, a revelation of the powers and limits of the imagination as it struggles to comprehend what sensations registering and match it with an appropriate concept, nor what makes us aware of the ideals of reason, the ideas of God, of self, of immortality, humanity, the universe as a whole, those ultimate realities that for Kant lie beyond human sensory or perceptual knowledge. The key insight, we should add, McKee argues, is that the sublime is an experience in which we rise to a crucial form of intellectual maturity, transcending the personally and culturally disabling illusion that the ideas of reason convey metaphysical truth or dogmatic knowledge. The potential gerontological interest of the remote country seat passage is increased for McKee by the age differentiation going on in the passage. The temperamental and tonal characteristics of these well-thinking people, contemplating, if not actually enacting, a form of voluntary exile, are quite distinct from the fantasies of young people, contemplating Robinson Crusoe-like possibilities of island retreat. Long, sad experience and loss of pleasure in the company of others are the driving forces behind a desire which need not be geriatric. Kant tells us that the well-thinking are getting older, not that they're old, though the impression given is emphatically of that order. It's hard not to hear an echo of Aristotle expatiating in the rhetoric on the selfish, guarded, antisocial character of the old. Painfully conscious from experience of the gap between the real human situation with its falsehood, ingratitude, and infliction of all imaginable evil on people. That's McKee citing Kant. Intelligent persons at this stage of maturity are subject to an ethically imbued form of sadness. Their fantasy of detachment shows us what the aesthetic experience of the sublime can teach us, a lesson in humanism, in short, where humanism is an ideal in need of protection from the real nature of humanity. It is to me an attractive idea that the critique of judgment might have a part to play in a practical psychological study of late life withdrawal. And I warm theoretically to the rekindling of a classical idea that retirement might constitute a form of philanthropy. In essence, I take myself out of the picture because if I were to stick around, I'd have to hate humanity when all my best desires and intentions are to love it. This is in effect the logic of cynicism at the point where the cynic can no longer stand the task of setting right the rest of humanity and removes himself from the marketplace, Zarathustra on the mountain, rather than Diogenes in the marketplace. I struggle, however, with what Lopez might call the concealed social scaffolding. A country seat's a very comfortable berth for cynicism. Living in a far-flung outpost of East Prussia, Kant was presumably thinking of aristocratic estates far from Berlin. There are, one imagines, servants. I struggle also with Kant's closing decision to count this sad longing for retreat amongst the vigorous effects and not the dejected sadness that would constitute a merely sentimental response to all that's wrong with the world. The two objections are indeed relatable. Looking to Benedict de Saussure, Kant notes with approval that the famous mountaineer put in place some protections against too burdensome an idea of retreat. There must be some degree of hospitality as we contemplate the sublimity of the wasteland. I'm aware of a slight air of flippancy seeming to accrue around some of what I'm saying. It's not just emanating from the desire to keep Zoom-tired people animated on a Saturday in May after more than a year online. We can stop the slides at this point if you like. Thank you very much. Kant, excuse me, I'm going to take a swig of coffee at this section break. Kant helps me to think about why time of life reflected in depth of maturity may make a difference to aesthetic experience and aesthetic judgment. I don't entirely accept Kant's terms. Indeed, I increasingly find the division between sublime and beautiful unhelpful, certainly challengeable. But the recognition that time and good thinking provide a qualitatively different access to aesthetic judgment seems to me right. Qualitative doesn't necessarily mean superior. In a sense, Kant is asking a more ethically interesting version of Parfit's first scenario for the future. Suppose I believe that with increasing knowledge and experience, I shall grow wiser. If we draw Parfit and Kant together, it's not so obviously the case that on this assumption, I should give to my future evaluative desires more weight. Rather, on the basis of Kant's scenario, I may think to give desire itself less weight. Other problems then loom. The idea that the old give desire less weight can't be a normative assumption, please. The field of critical age studies is rightly very largely defined politically by resistance to such depletive accounts of later life desire. But reading Kant alongside Parfit does at least offer a way of thinking about aesthetic judgment as possessing a temporal arc through which accrued experience across a lifetime will be a crucial driver in potentially revising what judgment is and what contribution it is making to wisdom, and in putting the definition of wisdom itself somewhat up for grabs. I'm going to break off a minute to say I was thinking about the discussion yesterday, the brief discussion in the question session about the language of expertise. It does seem to me that a problem with the language of expertise is that it too tends to close down discussion of changing judgments of taste over time. It's one of the places we go when we want to say that there's something we bring to the public discussion of value. And it seems to me that a better discussion wouldn't dispense with expertise, but would filter into expertise more strongly what changing judgments of taste over time are incorporated into expertise. The capacity to change one's judgment seems to me a crucial factor in it, to get better at what we do, to put it really crudely, but also to change as the situation around us changes, the culture around us changes. At this point, we need to be able to consider how all this tends to work out in ordinary life, as Adam Phillips put it, and very tentatively what sorts of pattern this temporal arc tends to cover, without losing sight of Amélie Rorty's injunction to be very wary indeed of implicit normativity. That our aesthetic tastes change is beyond question. Well, unquestionable, I'm going to put that out there. Unless we're developmentally arrested, few of us carry forward the passion for Goodnight Moon that animated us when we were 2. We outgrow immature tastes, at least to the extent that we cease to seek frequent repetition of these experiences. But some of them remain alive in us, ready to be reactivated in the presence of children or by way of voluntary return. John Dewey has some characteristically growth-oriented sentences in Art as Experience about going back to old tastes as a form of occasional revisiting of past experience in a context where continual variation of aesthetic experience is essential to life. Desire for variety is, he writes, the manifestation of the fact that being alive we seek to live until we are cowed by fear or dulled by routine. The art we were drawn to earlier in our lives is, he suggests, like the return after many years to childhood's home, a recurrence with a difference. Nostalgia is only a small part of it. And given the rush of interest in nostalgia as a critical window on the violence of the sublime, it's worth remembering nostalgia can be a subcategory of all aesthetic experience. In Kantian terms, whether we're in the presence of the beautiful or the sublime, the longing for an aesthetic that feels like home can be more or less vibrant, more or less ethically charged. George Eliot gives trenchant and troubled expression in The Mill on the Floss to what happens if this relation of present to past tastes goes wrong, is arrested. Memory and imagination urge a sense of privation too keen to let her heroine taste what is offered in the transient present. Teenage taste is next door to me. I haven't time to explore it here, but I've been living with it in lockdown, so I want to say something brief. On the way to maturity, it invites perhaps more in the way of self-ironization, certainly in retrospect. My tastes were out on a limb, my colleague Sophie Ratcliffe writes in Lost Properties of Love. Then 3 decades on, I feel much the same. It's a joke, also in a nice way a boast, and it gets us succinctly to the next observable stage in a process of maturing, whereby tastes continue to vary, be displaced, sometimes corrected by experience and education, while something's nevertheless preserved of a vital teenage desire to launch out on one's own and assert something that feels like independence in the matter of taste. It's not surprising, Bourdieu writes, with more insight than humor maybe, I can't tell from the translation, I should go back to the original, that bourgeois adolescents who are both economically privileged and temporarily excluded from the reality of economic power sometimes express their distance from the bourgeois world, which they cannot appropriate, by a refusal of complicity, whose most refined expression is a propensity towards aesthetics and aestheticism. The best, or at least most interesting of these teenagers, if I read Bourdieu right here, will, like some women of the bourgeoisie, take revenge in aesthetics, as he puts it. You must think there's something really dreadful going on in the bedroom next door to me. It's not dreadful, it's just funny and richly heterogeneous. It's a comparison that gives a helpful nudge on what story we may be assuming thereafter for maturity. Either, I take it, women of the traditional bourgeoisie lacking independent power are also lacking a key element of agency necessary for aesthetic maturity. Or, more interestingly, there are no guarantees on maturity. Mature taste itself clearly has to mean something more and other than being on the way toward Kant's late life capacity to rise into the sublime. For him, it means having acquired enough in the way of education, study, and exposure to culture to practice discrimination. In the appendix on the methodology of taste, he writes of the necessary introduction to the study of beauty, lying not in precepts, but in the culture of the mental powers through those prior forms of knowledge that are called humaniora, presumably because humanity means, on the one hand, the universal feeling of participation, and on the other hand, the capacity for being able to communicate one's inmost self universally. Mature judgment is then about finding the happy mean between the lawful constraint on taste, that is the highest culture, and the commitment to freedom, which gives taste force and, it seems to me more surprising in Kant's account here, correctness, he says. Mature taste is, in other words, inextricably social while being explicitly self-centered, an ability to take pleasure in hitting upon the mean, in James Meredith's nice translation. A credible 21st century account of mature judgment and values likely to have a lot of trouble with the happy mean. But the point here isn't to look again toward a relaxation of Kantian criteria for taste or Arnoldian. In other words, not to, although obviously I think there's towards a pluralization of standards amid the plurality of cultural forms and interests, the withdrawal of aesthetic judgment from many quarters of culture, the much deeper probing of emotional and other non-rational criteria for aesthetic judgment, and so forth, not least investment in dissensus. Disputing value is a crucial way of experiencing value. There are interesting contributions to the critical literature on aesthetics in recent years that touch on the possibility of a more mobile relation, a more mobile theoretic relation to the temporal arc of life. I wonder, for example, what might be done differently with Sean Guy's influential account of cuteness as an aesthetic misuse of childish taste. There's surely an intriguing dimension to the temporal articulation of judgment across a lifetime that emerges when the sociologist's independent variable becomes activated as if it were the primary explanatory factor. An approach to the subject via that route might make a critical virtue out of what is otherwise, for the most part, a problem, a gap created in the interstices of disciplines with non-congruent ways of shaping their questions and thus left talking across one another. In that context, it makes sense to me that the place in which this paper found its starting point was psychoanalysis. I could go back to Adam Phillips to conclude, but I'm conscious of using his thinking on the duration of truth of insight somewhat analogically to talk about judgments of taste. Let me, for the sake of directness, go back instead to the Russian nobleman. And this is where I'm going to upset you all by being outrageous. He's not, I have already said, a character in a realist novel. He's a schematization through which to think about the validity or otherwise of reasoning about personal identity over time. As such, he's helpful and sufficiently realized to serve a philosophy of reasons. But it follows from much of what I've been saying about variation of judgment over time, looping back with the difference, and continually reassessing where we sit within a social scaffolding for judgment that includes social assistance to invest differently in judgments of taste as we age. Follows from all that the Russian nobleman looks much less suited to the job of modeling aesthetic judgment over time. Consider what force the scenario would have if his concern were not the durability of his political convictions, but how long his aesthetic judgments would last. Promise me, let us imagine him saying, that if I ever change my mind about my love of Tolstoy, he had declared in writing to be countersigned by you, and ask you to revoke this document, you will not consent. He adds, I regard my judgment of Tolstoy's merits to be essential to me. If I lose this taste and you find me spending hours in my study immersed in Chechen women's writing, I want you to think that I cease to exist. He sounds not only, as he already did, a narcissist of a curiously needy variety, a narcissist in need of propping up, but bizarrely misplaced in his location of identity. It's not that I can't think of individuals, friends indeed, for whom developed, cultivated, deeply committed tastes seem defining of their personality. If my composer friend Robin was suddenly to declare a passion for Italian pop, I would indeed worry about him. But as a final provocation, let me suggest that aesthetic judgments do not, I'm worrying about the strength of my intensifier, do not in the main, do not have to have the same existential importance as political and moral judgments. Let me read that again so you get it. As a final provocation, let me suggest that aesthetic judgments don't have to have the same existential importance as political and moral judgments, especially moral ones. The commitments they generate don't in the main, maybe, what's the strength, do not have to possess the same depth. We are across a lifetime accruing experience that makes it perfectly acceptable, even essential to life, for us to shift aesthetic gears. Perfectly acceptable also to allow the poet to indulge the world, it may be many times over with different selected poems where new choices will have a validity of their own or not up for dissensus. To think accurately about judgments of taste across a lifetime, I'm suggesting pluralization is essential in temporal terms, and with it some kind of vocabulary for allowing different commitments to come to the fore and others retreat under the rub of time. Thank you. Silence. It's the Zoom silence. There we go.
Thank you, Helen, for a wonderful and varied and ambitious lecture. You said behind the curtain before we began that it might seem a very English talk. The beginning of my comment is going to seem very American. When I hear you cite John Guillory on the homogeneous literary culture that reigns in his country, America, I find it hard to believe I'm not just hearing an American translation of Bourdieu, and Bourdieu on a visit to America didn't see or hear or taste much. It strikes me, this idea of a homogeneous literary culture, as a completely academic fantasy of academic omnipotence. But that feature of Guillory's writing in his book on cultural capital, and indeed the very idea of the European idea of cultural capital that he imports into America, reflects a fact about American culture, that what intellectual culture we have, and I wouldn't confine the arts to that same space the way Guillory does, but never mind. What we have of it is extraordinarily bound in by canons of academic respectability. And the reason for this isn't to be, laid to, academic narrowness or aridness, but it's that I live in a profoundly anti-intellectual culture. It's been that way for a long time. It's getting more that way all the time. What there is of intellectual life is very unfortunately confined to a large extent to universities. But we should take care not to confuse the very idea of culture with what goes on in academic canon making and breaking. This is a perspective seems to be misjudged on the way life is lived in these parts. That's very common, not only to aesthetically academic commentators, but also to European visitors who then occasionally are found to pronounce on American culture with authority. I have in mind Umberto Eco, Jacques Derrida, others. They have had the experience, a good many of them, of breaking out of respectable, traditional, classically based culture. What they don't know about America, and it sometimes seems nobody can tell them, is that Americans of any intelligence and refinement are trying to break into traditional culture. There's nothing like it that you get in K through 12 public schools or private schools. And for better or worse, the universities have been made the experience of culture for Americans, aside from mass culture, aside from pop culture, which are important and which are an important shaper of feelings. But that's not what we tend to be talking about when we talk about tradition, literary culture, cultural capital, and so on. A couple of remarks on Parfit, and I appreciate your ironic approach to his thought experiment and enter into it very warmly. One odd thing about it is the assumption from point zero when he makes that decision, or when his Russian in the thought experiment makes the decision, that he knows what it is at that moment to, quote, grow wiser. That, it seems to me, is not an assumption that could be made by anyone who shares the idea of wisdom that I find in writers like, oh, well, I will just rehearse the usual ones that I came up with yesterday: Plato, Montaigne, Kant, Wordsworth, if you like, Whitman, whoever. And another guiding premise of the Parfit experiment is that a contract, in this case, it's a contract with yourself to be overseen by your executor, someone else, that a contract with myself should somehow be more binding than physical and psychological identity that I can feel with myself. So we're on that view to regard ourselves as the carriers of appetites, sensations, and the ability to enter into contracts. And that seems a most peculiar idea of what human individuality and human nature can be. So for a counterstatement against Parfit, and Helen, you were a little worried about going to old chestnuts, I'll go to an older one, a very short poem by Wordsworth, which most of the people here will know. My heart leaps up when I behold a rainbow in the sky. So was it when my life began, so is it now I am a man. So be it when I shall grow old, or let me die. The child is father of the man, and I could wish my days to be bound each to each by natural piety. And it's the self-identity involved in that last, if you want to call it, metaphor or thought of Wordsworth's, of one's days being bound each to each from youth to age, barring a total break from insanity or catastrophe of some kind. It's that wish that I think is involved in what we might come to mean by wisdom. And I agree with you very strongly that our idea of what counts as wisdom for us can change over time, can be modified. I would dissent from your, what to call it, obiter dictum, that we should fall away from our original affection for Goodnight Moon. I actually think, having not heard it read to me as a child, I was born too late, but having read it many scores of times, that anyone who loses their affection for Goodnight Moon is somebody I don't want to talk to for long. But this doesn't invalidate your larger point that our estimation of these early experiences of taste can change as we grow more able to make comparisons and make the comparisons with more refinement. So the idea of a change in judgment that your paper centers on and ends by putting to us very clearly, I think is coherent with an understanding of personal identity, whereby memory of the past, consciousness of the present, and our imagination of the future are perhaps bound each to each, in which the child can be thought of as father of the man, as the originator of what comes later, and in some ways superior. And yet that looking back wish claims only one big thing in common with the child, and that is the immediate sensation of being bound to the world itself. So that our fidelity to the world, our piety for nature, if you want to call it that, can't be separated from natural piety towards a life in which one's days may be bound each to each. And that binding is not contractual, and it doesn't exclude change. I was thinking of a case in which my critical, if you will, estimation of a writer has changed over time. I could talk about it. I was thinking of Robert Lowell, whom I still value highly as a gifted poet, but whom I once thought of as a figure of wisdom. I suppose now I would say I can't be unfaithful to my early and sensational experience of Lowell's poetry, but the wisdom he seems to represent has grown smaller and more circumscribed. And this has to do with a lot of things about my own growth, a lot of things about the culture, a lot of things that one can find out from reading biographies and so on. I wanted to ask you if there is an instance of your judgment of a work of art or an artist becoming modified over time, and how that could exemplify the sort of phenomenon you're describing in your talk.
Okay. Shall I answer now, or does Ben want to? Wow, look at the hands.
Sure, answer now, and then Ben
Yeah.
Barrett may have a question, and then we'll go to audience.
Let me start with Guillory, because to be honest, I'm trying to capture whether you're making a criticism of my paper's use of Guillory or whether you're criticizing Guillory, because I have no problem with your complaint against Guillory.
No, I think I understood you on Guillory, but I was giving an American perspective on this fellow American as being far too European and academic.
Okay, fine, right, because you had me deeply worried. That
No. I did not take you to be, putting your hand on the Bible of cultural capital and saying, yes, this all seems to be true.
Okay, fine, I'm relieved. It is a worry to me that somebody, I used to be European, I still feel European, as well as New Zealander, as well as English and Scottish, that it is a worry to come to America and to enter the conversation about the humanities and to know that you come from a different place, but the place is not as different as it was. The hemorrhaging of students in the last year from UK universities suddenly puts us in a debate that sounds very much more like yours. But I stick by the element of the paper, which is saying something about, and it's quite interesting that you and I, David, are in danger of having this conversation without mentioning until the very end the word time, because the core bit of the first part of the paper is trying to talk about why is it that when we introduce various kinds, and there could be many more of them on display here, I've given you a rather heterogeneous set of them. Why is it then when we try to put systems in place to think about aesthetic value, the temporality that we actually live through tends to be the thing that disappears, except anecdotally? So I did think about starting this paper with Charles Darwin, in his autobiography, going, oh God, I feel so embarrassed. Why have I lost my taste for Shakespeare? Just can't read the stuff anymore. I actually dislike the quotation, and it's turned up in too many Victorian papers of late, so I left it. But the predicament of culture in America it seems to me all the more important that we should be able to have the conversation about why it is that the pluralization of our tastes across a lifetime seems so hard to incorporate into the case made for culture. So I may be, were other texts in front of us, I would be very surprised if we didn't all feel that we'd learned a great deal from the cultural studies moment. And it's that ability to join the discussion about changing the canon in front of us, changing the number and the variety and the kind of aesthetic objects in front of us, at the same time as holding on to the criteria that allow you to talk about accrued expertise. And what I'm really looking for is a description of how we live the experience of changing our judgment that would give us a fuller account without simply falling into the anecdotal. Is that okay? That makes sense?
That's okay, and I have fallen flat on my anecdotal face, but there we are.
No, it's fine. It's cool. Is that pressure for a theoretical language? Maybe one shouldn't have it. One of the things people, having written The Value of the Humanities, people very often come to me and say, this is the conversation we have among ourselves. What are we supposed to say when we talk to the representative from the government funding department, or whatever it is? And I nearly always say, start with the specific and make the specific as vivid and exciting as you can. So put the particular instance of culture, my colleague doing Shakespeare with puppets during plague in Germany, do something that hooks them in. and tells them what the thing has to say and why it resonates in the culture. So I wouldn't have this kind of discussion with the outside world at all. Very quickly on Parfit, yes, that's what's so peculiar about it, that the attempt to think about one's future as if it were a contract that could be decided. One of the peculiarities of aesthetic judgment, it seems to me, is that we cannot, what's the phrase I was thinking about using, that judgments of taste can't be confidently projected into the future, because part of what you're projecting is yourself as judge. And then finally, an example, well, I feel bad about this because I'm not absolutely sure, and this may open up other questions, I guess, whether it's a change in my own judgment or whether it's something more to do with tiredness and a certain sameness that comes with teaching it too often. I've really gone off Virginia Woolf with some, feedback now, with the exception of 3 Guineas. I just feel stale on it, very stale on it. And that's probably a failing in me. But the difference of being an academic, I think a professional in the field, is that one knows that that's not good enough, that you need to go back and you need to think about what is it about the features of the writing that are generating that feeling in me. I think I know what it is that is so often seems to generate a theory of the self and the plurality of the self. And I feel as if the theory is sometimes marching before the prose.
Yeah, there's also the curious fact of the difference between, this is true of teaching literature in my experience, the difference between a book you can admire and without embarrassment and rate high, and a book that lends itself to teaching.
Yeah,
they are overlapping. There's heavy overlap, but they're somewhat different things. Let me go to Ben Barash, and I'll treat you, Ben, now. The obligation to make a comment is lifted since I've gone on long enough. But why don't you be the first member of the audience to ask a question, and then we'll go to others.
Why don't we go ahead to Jonathan Lear and Akhil Bilgrami? They've had their hands up.
Okay, good.
Let's just go forward.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for your paper. I just thought it was fabulous.
I'm worried about it. The fabulous is nice. I'll take the fabulous and enjoy it. Thank you.
Yeah, please. I mean, it's just been a really wonderful way to spend a morning in Chicago. I wanted to talk to you a bit about this issue of temporality and judgment and judgment changing over time. You sort of began and ended with this. In the end, you mentioned psychoanalysis as a kind of it's in your mind as something you're trying to use to think through. You talk about the Russian nobleman as sounding like a narcissistic, needy individual, which seems to me to be right. But it seemed to me there's more you could do in this vein around the place of the timelessness or atemporal in a temporal life. I mean, I take that to be one of the real psychoanalytic insights, is that the unconscious is, Freud put it as timeless. And, David used the word omnipotence. And I think that's it's a theme of a struggle that is bound up in time. I think that, one of the things that puzzles me, like with the discussion about the Russian nobleman, it's part of our culture that it isn't part of the normal discussion of the Russian nobleman that to think of him as omnipotently and atemporally killing off any future self. And that the principles around which he's doing the murdering being rather superficial, legitimations of a hatred of time and a hatred of the finiteness of human being, and the desire to omnipotently control all of time via a timeless attack. So I mean, I think there are issues about hatred and omnipotence that are tied to temporality and the timelessness in temporality that I think really, I think are very applicable to the kinds of issues you're struggling with. I mean, the later guy, the elderly, the aging Russian who does change his mind, there's a lot we don't know about why he changes his mind or what goes into it. And I mean, I think this gets back to David's point about wisdom. I mean, that, it could be he's as much of, it could be that whatever it is, the 60-year-old Russian is as much of a childish, omnipotent attacker of his past, as the younger one was a childish, omnipotent attacker of his future. But it could be that he's a person who has gained wisdom over time in the developmental process of changing one's aesthetic judgment. You can't tell from the act itself which it is. You can't read it off, or did he or didn't he deal with his inheritance differently. It's just not the domain in which you could find that kind of thing out or make a decision. But it is in the domain, I think, of the issues you're working with, which is, what is temporality humanly, and what is the place of timelessness interjecting itself in a temporal life. So anyway, I loved your paper, but I think that there's some very basic psychoanalytic thoughts that have just been left out of the discussion.
Yeah, no, I did think about using, as I said at the end, the Adam Phillips essay more fully, because one of the things that it makes me think about was just, I thought there was enough complication going on for one paper, certainly in my own head. One of the questions that he's asking is, how can we deal differently? How should we deal differently in the domain of the aesthetics? Because he's reviewing Christopher Bolus and I'm going to forget, it doesn't matter. Bolus will do actually as a subject. How should we deal differently with the validity of aesthetic judgments within a system, i.e. psychoanalysis, which has tended to think about the symptom as a problem, as an arrest, okay, as something that can do damage, especially in certain kinds of clinical scenario. And it doesn't get fully developed, but I think that seems to me a really rich theme of exploration. What's the difference between valuation and getting stuck in one's appreciation of something? Yeah. One answer to which is the ability to enrich it through your expertise, or through visiting, or through teaching, thinking about it differently.
Thank you.
So there was a question then also from Akil Bilgrami, question and maybe a comment.
Thanks for that terrifically interesting paper. In the passage of your paper's argument or dialectic, you related your discussion of Parfit to ideas about cultural capital. And I'm just wondering whether something like this might help come to some grips with the relations between those two things. If you take Parfit's view with sort of subtract the gratuitous metaphysics about the self and suicide of the present self, etc., and just think of it as outlining a way of distinguishing between commitments and desires. That is, commitments are such that one thinks of one's departure from them as a kind of weakening. And that's what Parfit is in a sense saying. If you subtract all the self about myself dies and so on. But one has desires and one has commitments, and commitments are to be distinguished because they have this temporal element that one would think of departures from them as weakening. And so one holds the desires in a normatively sort of grounded way if one does that, unlike other desires. My desire for tea every morning or something, if I cease to have it, I wouldn't think of it as the kind of desires that I might hold in that way. For instance, in the way that Ulysses held his desires. He tied himself to the mast precisely because he held a desire and he thought it would be a weakening to succumb to the sirens. So if you see things that way, I was wondering if the idea of maturity and a lifetime's judgment over a lifetime, the very idea of maturity that you're exploring there might come from the fact that commitments held in this Parfitian way, without all the gratuitous metaphysics of the self, commitments held in this way might conflict.
Yep.
I mean, we're not monsters of coherence.
Yeah.
We might have Parfitian desires which are in tension with one another. And we often do. And we deliberate our way out of these conflicts. And part of maturity is what we gain from such a lifetime of deliberation. So profiting commitments of this kind are not, as David was saying, part of a homogeneous mental outlook. It's, one has conflicts and tensions and so on. And so now the question arises, by what lights do we deliberate when we deliberate our way out of these conflicts? And I would think that we deliberate by the lights of something like cultural capital, though I prefer to call it cultural commons, right? We have a background of cultural commons. The conflicts are in the foreground of one's thinking. We can't possibly resolve those conflicts in the foreground. We need a background. And so part of the maturity consists in an evolving background of the cultural commons to which we get acculturated. And the way that we occupy our place in cultural life is a little bit like Neurath's boatman. We make overcome these conflicts. We sort of revise our things within the boat, and we don't do it from a position outside. And it seems to me you can have it all ways. You don't have to recoil that much from Parfit if you just read him as having a lower profile to capture many of the things you want to say about maturity and so on, along something roughly like these lines. Sorry, I went on for too long.
I'm very happy with that, and it helps thicken out what I was trying to say greatly. Thank you. In the simplest, okay, let me rephrase my problem thus. I take on board everything you say. I agree with it. I think in various smaller bits of the paper, it's already there, the idea that we inhabit a complex cultural commons, and it's the inheritance of that business of being in culture that we're about. I still find it difficult to find places where the temporality of reaching something that we might call maturity, but then having a version of maturity that allows for movement back and forth. It doesn't, maybe I need to go back to Ricoeur or something like that. It seems to me so rich a part of what we're doing when we educate, but also when we live with the stuff of culture, that I want a language for it. And really Parfit is, for me, it's a heuristic on a heuristic. It's the inadequacy of the model that enables me to name what's missing. And for actually the larger question that's interesting, because I live with someone who runs a social science foundation now, is the yawning gap between certain social science systems models still and the models that we might want to be able to use in talking about temporalities of literature. Okay, thank you. That was very helpful. I might steal the Ulysses on the Mars, but okay.
Other participants who would like to comment or question?
We've got Ernest and Michael and Amanda.
Okay, thank you for calling on them. Go ahead. Ernest first.
Thank you. I enjoyed the paper very much. I think we can relate this in some ways to our conception of canons. Canons never have been static or completely replaced. And the idea that somehow academics or critics create canons or questions of taste is at best marginal. Who does it are other artists. If works are influencing art that's being made, literature that's being made into the future, then things from the background, the deck is constantly reshuffling, and things that may have been unimportant at one point become more important. And as new art is introduced, the way that we as individuals think about and view what we've valued in the past also reshuffles. So in a sense, what we do is constantly go back and forth. I think it's almost impossible to do otherwise. As we learn something new, what happens is, I think our process is often retrospective. I'm introduced to something new, And then I go and start investigating or thinking about what influenced it. And that's added to what's already in my mind. It's similar to teaching, for instance. We often think chronologically in going from starting in 1900 and going up to the 21st century. Well, there's a way that teaching can be more effective is if you start with the 21st century with something that the student is interested in, and then going back and exploring its antecedents. So you've rooted something in the student's contemporary interest, and they're seeing where it's evolving from. To comment.
That's fine, thank you. Yeah, the reason when I gave myself the task of trying to define the work of the humanities in chapter 1 of the Value of the Humanities, the reason that I put that piece on the end of the description, which says that we are unlike other disciplines and divisions of the university in that we do not consider the work that went in generations before redundant. Okay, so it seems to me still a distinctive element of English, history, languages, music, all the art subjects, that the fact that they've been replaced to a significant degree in the in the main body of the culture, so to speak, doesn't make them redundant. So it's that element of you're talking now about the incoming and the outgoing and the wash of the whole that seems to me crucial to that bit of advocacy of what we do. Thank you.
Michael Clune.
Thank you very much, Helen. That was a fabulous talk. I wanted to ask, you're thinking about modes of skepticism about one's aesthetic judgments that take place over long periods of time in a way I think is very compelling. But I wonder, if, to my mind, what really, what we have a really difficult time grappling with is the way that the structure of aesthetic education itself always or often involves a kind of skepticism about my current preferences or desires, right? So this kind of skepticism, I wonder if the models you're adducing, and this I think is amplifying things that others have said, but I wonder if the models you're adducing imagine situations when at every given moment I'm confident in my tastes, I'm confident in my judgments, and then I'm looking forward or backwards and imagining myself changing in such a way that would make those put pressure on those judgments. It seems to me that rather what often happens is I'll use the discussion about England versus America. I grew up in a working class family in Ireland and then moved to America, and so I had these kinds of issues have a certain salience for me. But for example, when I wanted to get into jazz, right, I thought that jazz would be a cool thing. But when I was listening to jazz, I found it boring, right? But I had a sense that my current taste or judgment was in some ways inadequate to the kind of competence and the kind of judgments I was trying to acquire. So I was skeptic, so my skepticism at that moment was the skepticism that allowed me access to that art form. Was one that was at the moment being skeptical about my current desires and my current preferences. And I feel like what really often blocks the project of aesthetic education is the consumerist, vision that says that there's no good reason to be skeptical about my current preferences. So I'll just invite you.
It's fine. I'm afraid I skipped past this rather quickly because it's what I did in the long life. Sorry, when I was reading Parfit there, what I said on that occasion is there's a problem here with compounding desire and judgment. And the reality of our judgment is that, yes, it is provisional. And one of the things I wanted to say to Puff, but then would still want to say now, is it's perfectly possible for me to take it on trust from better judges than myself, as I deem them to be. For example, my teacher said, there is something here that's worth my getting to grips with. I don't get it, I don't yet like it, but I'm in the classroom and I'm working on it. Yeah, and I think that's enabling younger people to have that experience without feeling crushed by one's expert judgment. Or, you know, one of the things that most actually galvanized me, but it should have really driven me insane, was having a lot of it was the Adorno voices. I think they probably did more for my education than anyone else, was these pronounced judgments from boys, you know, 1 year older than me. The preemptiveness of the judgment kind of let me go, what is going on here? I need to understand this. I can't make that judgment without knowing what it's actually doing. It's there are good and maybe more comical versions of it where it's part of the taste for it, and actually goes to the earlier part of what you were saying. I absolutely think that the reason you didn't get the paper that I've just finished for a volume that George Levine is doing is that I thought you deserved something fresh. But, you know, responding to a volume that he's putting together at the moment on aesthetic value, that is precisely the line that I was taking, that the difference between us and other creatures, birds that have a sense of the aesthetic, is that we profoundly invest value in dissensus around value, that the Creative Commons is also a commons of argument, and that argument is a pleasure, you know, a huge pleasure in saying your bit of jazz is not my bit of jazz, or whatever it may be.
So, before we go to the last question from Amanda Lowe, just to note this fact, which comes out in the exchange just now, that knowledge of what we don't like, what makes us say no, not just I would like my sophistication about jazz to be greater, so maybe I can learn to listen, but you know you don't like it, but you don't know the reasons yet. Putting it together in an intelligent way, if it comes, you know, not just from a dumb gut reaction, but something you can sense is more subtle to begin with, that's a large part of taste too. And I think it may be one element of whatever constancy there is in our personal identity vis-a-vis works of art or culture. If that comment of mine were to go on, it could lead to a partial defense of misanthropy. But I'll stop and go to Amanda's question, and this will have to be the last question.
So actually, let's hear from Yipeng Ong. Love to get her into the conversation.
Well, let's get Amanda first, since I already called on her, and then we'll have two more. Go ahead.
Okay.
Okay. Now I feel like I'm cutting in line, but it's okay.
No, you're not.
Thank you so much for this great paper, Helen. One of the things that I found really exciting about it was that it almost felt like it gave me permission to admit the fact that there are writers who I get tired of, you know, writers who are very important in my intellectual development and who I see as, you know, being crucial for my thinking and really in the background of some of the work that I'm doing. But I need to sort of shelve for a while because I have that feeling of like, oh, I just cannot read Melville right now. I just can't do it. And then you sort of know that you're going to cycle back and it's going to feel reactivated for you at some point, but that there are times when your tastes, as you were saying, do change for particular reasons. I was also thinking, your paper also made me think a lot, because you mentioned she and I, it made me think a lot of her discussion of disgust at the end of Ugly Feelings, where she talks about where disgust is sort of like for her is an aesthetic category that has a certain urgency. It sort of is urging action at a particular moment. And so it has a kind of, it's almost extremely timely, as opposed to the belatedness or untimely sort of like longer durée lasting of other works of art. And then this is sort of associative, but that also made me think of Benjamin's account of the Treuerspiel as also being about, like, as an aesthetics that wants to create a sense of decomposition, that death needs to become a more pressing part of life.
What should I come in on that? Because it's got a lot in
Yes.
that. I think one of the things that brings down is, and maybe I need more sentences to do it, that when I was reflecting briefly on ugly feelings, it seems to me that there is a partial model there. Lots of different kinds of vocabulary. I think critical vocabulary could do it. And it's a particular interest to me because I work partly in critical age studies, which is to think about these arcs of a life and these different views of time of life as alternative languages, if you like, for positions in relation to the aesthetic. The problem, especially if you work in age studies, is that it so often resolves into something metaphorical or quasi-allegorical, as if in talking about maturity. It's like late style, and it would say debates are we really talking about aging at all, or are we talking about a particular kind of aesthetic of anger and refusal and so forth? You're out of time, aren't we?
We almost are, but let's go to Yiping Ong, and this will be the last question. Go ahead.
Thank you, and thanks for a very lovely and interesting talk. I just wanted to ask a quick question really about how much you'd want to historicize this issue. Is there in your mind a moment at which it becomes possible to pose the question of how to weigh judgment across a lifetime as a genuine question? Like, does this topic only begin to make sense when we start to conceive of people as potentially being corrupted or altered in ambivalent ways in the course of their lives in time with others? Because, I just was curious about this because I hear you saying sort of various ahistorical claims about aesthetic judgment and humanity versus birds. But I'm just curious about the extent to which you want to situate this kind of topic at a particular moment in history.
To the question, I'm only just asking myself. I don't have an answer, but I'll pose it as a question to your question, is whether it is in fact the debate about canonicity and the concept of a generational inheritance that makes it harder to have that discussion. So it would be of interest to me to go back, because I think I can think immediately of, for example, Seneca or various examples in the classics where there is a notion that there's more of a notion of what you're maturing into. And the problem is that it becomes normative quite easily. But I think there is a concept there that one sits differently in relation to the culture. I suppose the danger for me would be doing Plato again in a way that's like kind of close to man boy in that model, which I don't want to do again, but I'll decode it. I think it's a really helpful question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Well, and thanks to all for your attention to this talk, and it was a wonderful talk. So to Helen Small especially, thanks, and we'll see you early this afternoon.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.